clear out Canaan, while he was patient with them, they had to fight, right? Because if they didn't fight, eventually they were going to lose. If they made covenants with these other peoples, they were going to be in trouble. And I think just in the same way with us, he's patient with us for a time with these sins. But if we don't wage war against them, and we don't remove them from our lives, they end up destroying us, right? Am I right? And so, if these sins which are so easily besetting us, those things which are ruining our lives today, we have a small amount of time to really wage war against them. And that's the point of this passage here today, and it's the point I want to share with you as well. Some of you have been pilots, or you know pilots, and you know that pilots who fly, they have two different rules by which they can go by. They can go by visual flight rules or instrument flight rules. And the preferable way to fly is by visual flight rules, meaning that there's enough, there are no clouds in the sky, and visibility is great enough where you don't need to use the instruments to fly by. You can, and they're not really high off the ground, but they can see out of their window, right? You can see the landmarks, you can see the mountains, you can see the runways, you can see the tall buildings. That's the best way to fly, where you just look out the window and see what you're flying into, right? But we all know that sometimes it's so cloudy, it's so hazy, it's so foggy or whatever, that they can't see far enough in front of them to go by visual flight rules, and they have to switch to instrument flight rules. And that means they have to use the stuff that they have, the computers in their cockpit, to tell them what's coming up in front of them and what to avoid and how high to go, how fast to go, so on and so forth. Well, I, in my life, would love to use visual flight rules for my spirituality. I'd love for everything every day to make sense, and for everything always, to be in a perfect frame of mind all the time, so that I don't have to, do things that I don't believe in or don't automatically know. I'd rather understand it all. But you and I both know that this is a cruel world, right? And we find ourselves enslaved too easily, and that we're weak as water, and that we're torn between Christ and the world all the time. We're discouraged, we're bankrupt, we're incomplete, we're anxious. And when we're all in a state of anxiety or bankruptcy or difficulty or trial or tribulation, that makes everything really foggy and really cloudy and really stormy. And more often than not, when you wake up in the morning, nothing makes sense. And you can't make decisions by what you can see for yourself. And your understanding is almost never appropriate for any matter that you have. And it's at that point that you have to result to the Word, right? You have to claim promises. You have to believe what Christ has said, what the Bible has said. You need to go on that. And that's difficult for us to do. But the reason I bring that up today is to say this. You're not going to defeat sin in your life. You're not going to grow in Him if you're only going to proceed by what makes sense to you today. And the battle against sin comes when we focus on Christ and what He said about Himself and what He said about us as His followers. So that's the point I want to make today by just walking through this passage with you very quickly this morning. And I want you to see some points that Paul makes along the way. The first point he makes in verse 15 is that we may be orphans in this place, but we do have a name. Look at verse 15 again. He says to the church there, "What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? May it never be." Okay. May it never be. We're created in the image of God. And because we're created in the image of God, we're created for one purpose, and that's to glorify Him, okay, and to enjoy Him forever. Now, I used to work in a group home, and I worked in two different group homes when I lived in Arizona. One was for kids who were bad or delinquents, kids who were committing crimes and they were difficult. But then there was another group home that I worked at later in my time there that just housed kids who were orphans, really. They lost their parents. And I always felt it was much more difficult to minister to the ones who are orphans, because that's hard. It's very hard for them. And I remember they always kind of clung to their name. I remember that. They didn't know, their whole home life was gone. They were living in a strange home with strange people, with strange rules and all that stuff. But they always loved to have their name, because their name was their, what reminded them of that they did have parents. They did have a former home. They do have a culture and a people and a family. And they were clinging to that idea while they were in there. In fact, a lot of times when you'd ask for their name, they'd give you their whole name. I thought that was interesting. In the same way, I know that we're orphans here in this world, that we've been cut off from God, and that we're kind of in a world that doesn't make sense anymore. This is not the Garden of Eden, obviously. And the world that we find ourselves in is full of deceit and anger and violence and duplicity and infidelity, and people treat each other poorly and all that kind of stuff. I understand that. And it's not what we want. But even though that's the case with this world, we do have a name. You know, we were made in the image of God, and the thing that we were created for was not for sin. Okay? And so if you want to find freedom in here, if you want to find what your meaning in life is, you know, Paul's saying, hey, listen, you gained salvation now, and now you use this salvation as a license to go out and live crazy. That is not what it was for. You know, you weren't given license to sin. You were given license to be holy. Okay. Christ coming to die for you on the cross did not mean now that you could go and live however you wanted. It meant that you could be who you were made to be. You could go home. You could be freed from the orphanage. You could be adopted back into God's family and in His home and live by His rules. Do you get it? And it just made no sense to him. You know, he said, what are you doing? That's not what you were made for. You know, if I took an eye exam and that eye exam showed that I needed glasses, and I was wearing glasses but I didn't like wearing glasses, what if I said, well, you know, I'm just not going to take the eye exam anymore. And because I don't take the exam, I can throw away the glasses. That's not going to work that way. You know, it's not the exam's fault that I had to wear glasses. It was my poor eyesight. And you can't get angry with the law because it's shown you that you're a sinner and that there are things in your life you shouldn't do. And you can't just say, well, you know, if I just throw away the law, I won't be broken anymore. That's not the case. Okay. The law was a blessing to all of us to show us that we needed Christ. And now that you have Christ, you don't throw away the exam. You know, you realize that you still need the law. You still need to be taught what is right and what is wrong. Look at verse 16. Verse 16 says, do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or of obedience resulting in righteousness? What Paul here is saying is that you don't have a choice. You're a slave. Okay? Every one of you is a slave. But you do have a choice as to who is your master. And not all slaves get a chance to pick their master, but you do. And you know, I like to think of us as people as weak as water. And you know very well that water cannot make its own shape, right? Water always takes the shape of its container. If you pour water into a vase, it looks like a vase. If you pour it into a bowl, it looks like a bowl. If you pour it on the ground, it collects in the smallest, you know, in the lowest depression. Water takes the shape of its container, and you're weak as water. So if you want to pour yourself into money, you're going to take the shape of money. If you want to pour yourself into politics, you're going to take the shape of politics. If you want to pour yourself into power, you're going to take the shape of power. If you want to pour yourself into relationships, you're going to take the shape of relationships. It's that simple. You're a slave to whatever you put yourself into. But what Paul here is saying is this: why not be a slave to righteousness? Because if you submit yourself to righteousness, what shape will you take? You'll take the shape of righteousness. You can be holy if you submit yourself to holiness. I love that picture. And so yes, you are a slave today. You are not free. None of you are free. But why don't you have the sense today, if you're going to be in bondage to something, be in bondage to Christ. At least He loves you. And by faith you can be healed. Okay. Look at verse 17. Verse 17 says, but thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which you were committed.